Josephus. I promise you, we were finishing today. I know I said last week was the last week, but this is definitely the last week. I'm out of material after this. So the last thing, so last week we were talking about different prophecies that we could kind of verify through Josephus's writings that actually occurred. And we didn't finish it up with, or I wanted to finish this up last week, but we just ran out of time. But we're going to be talking about Jesus' specific warnings about what happened during the destruction of Jerusalem. And this is sometimes called the Olivet Discourse, but you can find it in Matthew 24, Mark 13, and Luke 21. So today we're just going to kind of look at what Jesus said was going to happen, and look at specific examples from Josephus. And also we're going to be looking at some of the more other historical contexts and some of the archaeological record to kind of show that what Jesus said was going to happen actually happened. And we are not going to be looking at everything that Jesus says here because, like I said, last week, I think that 70 AD was a antitype. It was a shadow of things to come with the second coming. And so when Jesus is giving us this Olivet Discourse, he's giving us kind of a blended prophecy where he has some stuff that happens in 70 AD and he has stuff that happens with his return in the second coming. And it's hard to just say this specifically happened in 70 AD or this is specifically for his second coming. Because I think there's a lot of kind of mixed prophecies that happen here. So, okay. For those who don't know, like the Olivet Discourse happened in the last week of Jesus' life. He's in Jerusalem with the apostles, and they go and they tour the temple, and afterwards they're leaving, and they go over to the Mount of Olives, which is right across from where the temple is. So you have the temple, you have the Kidron Valley, and then on the other side is the Mount Olives, and you can see the temple from Mount Olives. But I'm just going to go ahead and read this. So there's three accounts, and this is from Matthew's account. He says, "Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, 'Do you not see all these things? Assuredly I say to you that not one stone shall be left here upon another, that shall not be thrown down.' Now as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, 'Tell us when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?'" Now, I specifically put Matthew's account here because we get the two different questions. We get, what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? But there's also talking about when will the destruction of the temple be. So the other two accounts don't bring up the second part where he talks about his the sign of his coming, the end of the age. But when you take all three accounts together, they all have little different bits to them, but when you put them all together, you kind of get the bigger picture. Yeah, Josh.
And just to add in here, and if I'm stealing your thunder, I apologize.
That's fine.
They are blending the questions together as one because to them, the temple wouldn't be destroyed until the end of the age.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So yeah, it's difficult to kind of piece through all of these. One thing I did when I first was studying this was I took all three accounts and I lined them up as best I could, verse by verse, and I color coded them to like see which account said the same things, which has differing accounts, but to just kind of get an overall picture of what all was discussed, what questions were asked, and what prophecies we can verify. And this is what inspired me to really study Josephus, because I really wanted to know what happened during the destruction of Jerusalem, what happened in 70 AD. So this kind of is what inspired me to go down this path. So yeah, at this point we're going to be looking at these like 5 different things that are brought up that I think you can definitively show happened during 70 AD, where we have the prophecy of not one stone left upon another. Jerusalem will be surrounded by enemies. Eagles will be gathered together. False Christs and false prophets will rise and being trampled by the Gentiles. And there's, these are coming from the 3 different accounts. You get these different kind of prophecies that we can show through Josephus' writings. Okay, so the first one we're going to talk about is, "Verily I say to you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down." Now, a lot of you might be asking, well, what about the Western Wall? Because if you're familiar with Jerusalem, the Western Wall is still there today. This was part of Herod's foundation to the temple. It's still a part of Jewish culture today, where every year on Tish B'Av, or not necessarily on Tish B'Av, but specifically on Tish B'Av, they go to the wall and they wail, and it's called the Wailing Wall, the Western Wall, and they'll put little prayers in the bricks as a remembrance of the destruction of the temple. And people are like, well, doesn't that mean that the temple, part of the temple, still stands? But really, when you look at Mark's account, he specifically says, and as they went out of the temple, and the disciples say unto him, Master, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here. And Jesus answered unto him and saying, see these great buildings. There shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. So specifically, what Jesus was talking about here is the temple itself and the buildings that were on top of the temple. I'm going to come back to this Herodian tower, but along with the temple, so the temple was this beautiful building that had been renovated by Herod the Great, right before Jesus' time. And along with it, so Herod was a half-Jew, and he was always worried about his position with the Jews. So when he first came into power, one of the things he did was renovate the temple, because he wanted to earn favor with the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and to really gain the trust of the Jews. So he renovates the temple, makes it beautiful, and he also builds this building called the Royal Stoa, which we don't really hear about in the Bible. It's not called that, but it was this massive, pillared complex at the south end of the temple. You can see it here. This is the Royal Stoa. And it had these giant tall columns. It had these coffers at the top with these elaborate paintings and decorations, and it was, according to Josephus, he said it was so beautiful that it was worthy of mention more than any other building under the sun. So, even Josephus was just talking about how beautiful the temple complex was. And these are the buildings that they were talking about when they say that not one stone be left upon another. That they raised the temple, they raised the Royal Stoa, the walls. So this doesn't show the walls on here, but this foundation, this is where the Western Wall is. It's on this side, on the western side. But there were these tall walls that went around to defend the temple, and those were all torn down. The temple was torn down. It was all raised flat with where the Temple Mount is today. I have questions on that. Okay. I do want to go back, though, because Josephus also mentions that there were these three towers that Herod had originally built. They were called the Phasaelus, the Hippicus, and the Mariamne. And these towers were 130, 140 feet tall. The base of the Hippicus Tower still is there today. It's called the Tower of David today, but it's named wrong, or they've renamed it afterwards. But this was one of the original tower bases built by Herod. But you got to imagine that it went up another couple hundred feet off of that. But Josephus said that they left these structures as a sign or a show of just how well fortified and how well defended Jerusalem was. Okay, and so speaking of the Western Wall, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's really cool. So, so this is a picture of the Western Wall here, and above it is the Temple Mount that we were talking about. So everything above here was raised and thrown down. Sorry, let me go back. I forgot to mention this. So this is on the southern side of the temple, so down here in this area, and these are actual impact marks that was left after the Romans tore down the Stoa, and they were throwing these buildings, these giant buildings and pillars down. That actually these impact zones in the street are still there today, and that's showing just how large and powerful these stones were that they were throwing down. That they still have the impacts left today that you can go and visit and look at. Okay, but on the Western Wall, so you see it's it looks like it's ground level, but really it goes down even further. So everything in Jerusalem is kind of built on top of stuff. So it's been built up over the years. So the ground level when, Jesus' time was probably another 20, 30 feet below here. And if you follow the wall across, this is a top-down view, but this is where the Western Wall is here. But if you kept going north, this is the Muslim quarter, and it's built on top of this archway here called Wilson's Arch. Well, they call it Wilson's Arch. It was actually called the Great Causeway back in Josephus's time. But in the 1800s, there was an archaeologist who kind of discovered its arches, and so it's named after him now, but it's the wrong name. So it's crazy because like underneath here, underneath the whole Muslim quarter, there's this first century archway, and even underneath that, there's So I'm going to have myself, but the Jews are not allowed to do any excavations on the Temple Mount. It's under Muslim control. They gave over possession of it after the 6 Days War or 7 Days War in the 1960s. So they are not allowed to do any archaeological digs or excavations under the Temple Mount. But they are allowed to do excavations underneath here, underneath the Muslim quarter. So they've been doing all these digging, and if you go on Google Maps, you can actually do like a walkthrough tour, and it's really cool because like you can go inside and you can see like original Herodian stones, Herodian columns and statues and things. They've got like stuff from the First Temple era, from Solomon's era. They even have stuff from when the Romans took over afterwards. It's really cool. We'll talk about that in a minute. But they have this giant stone under here in the foundations down. It would be like down in here, but it's called the Western Stone, and it's over 570 tons. Like it's just this massive stone. And it's considered one of the heaviest objects ever lifted by humans without like electronic machines. And you can see it's been damaged right here. And it's because that's where the Romans had dug down, and they get to this giant stone and they gave up because it was so large. They're like, we've gone far enough. Like they just kind of gave up because it was too much work. And then later on, as they tried to repair the foundation temple, as they built on top of it, you can see how much smaller the stones are. These large stones, these are the ones that were put in there by Herod the Great. Okay, any questions? Yeah.
Where is the Christian section?
So I don't know Jerusalem that well because I've never been there, but I believe it's like back this way. I know that there's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. I think is up kind of to the northwest. I don't know. I don't know the specific areas. I just know that the Muslim quarter is built here right on top of it, and that it was built literally on top of Wilson's Arch, and that this is, I think they call it the chain gate now, but this is what's the gate that like the kings would use, because up here, this takes you up towards what was called the upper city, where like Herod's palace was, and the rich and the affluent were, and they would take this they would take this bridge to get to the gate to get to the temple. Because there's a bit of a valley here, and that this allowed them to just cross straight across to get to the temple. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't know exactly where the Christians would be or where the Jewish quarter is. I just know that this specific area is where the Muslim quarter is.
Just a question.
Yeah.
The other question is, who owned the Muslim portion that you're talking about?
Yeah.
Who owned it before the 6 Day War?
So it would have been under Muslim control before that. Israel became a state in 1948 or whatever it was after World War II, and then they had this war that happened in late 60s. The Israelites won, but in order to like kind of maintain peace, they gave up control of the Temple Mount because we're going to talk about the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Those are two very holy sites to the Muslims, but they gave those up to the Muslims so that they were worried that they were going to cause further war by trying to take back the Temple Mount. So they just gave control of that to the Muslims. Consequence to that is the Muslims say you're not allowed to do anything on the Temple Mount. You're not allowed to do any digging, any excavations. They literally, so in the 80s, I think it was, there was a group that tried to dig underneath the Temple Mount, do their own excavations. Muslims found out about it, filled it up with concrete to stop them from going any further. which is terrible because, I mean, it's like a historical site, you're just pouring concrete in it. It's awful. What else was I going to say about that? Yeah, basically, the Muslims control the Temple Mount itself. The Jews are not allowed to do any digging or excavation there. All right, we're going to move on to the next prophecy, which was that Jerusalem is going to be surrounded. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you know that its desolation is near, from Luke 21:20. We talked about this when I talked about what I believed happened for the abomination of desolation. But basically, John of Gischala and his men were trapped inside of the Temple Mount. They got word out to the Idumeans. The Idumeans came and they literally surrounded the city. That's one possibility, but it also could be talking about, the Romans when they actually came and remember Titus set up a siege wall around Jerusalem, and it was literally completely isolated and blocked off by the Romans. So either way, one way or the other, yes, Jerusalem was surrounded by armies near its end. Okay, and then there's this interesting verse talking about, for wherever the carcass is, then the eagles will be gathered together. Matthew 24:28. And, the phrase eagle here is kind of surprising because you would think, it sounds like it's describing like a vulture, like a bird going after something dead. And we don't typically think of eagles like that, right? So I'm pretty sure that this is just a reference to the Romans. The Romans identified with the eagle. That was like one of their symbols. The army specifically would carry around banners. They had a standard that they would carry around that would identify the specific legions. And at the top of it, they had a literal golden eagle that they would carry around. And those standards were very important. They could never let them fall during battle. There was the whole thing with the Teutoburg Forest, around Julius Caesar's time, where they lost this big battle and they lost one of their standards, and they launched multiple campaigns to try to get it back. But it's just it was just a symbol of the Roman Empire, and I'm pretty sure that this verse is specifically referencing the Romans here. Okay. So false prophets. Okay, so Jesus warns that there's going to be a number of false prophets that come before the destruction. He says, and if any of you say, look, here is the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, for even the elect. Therefore I say to you, look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. Okay, I want you to specifically focus on in the desert. Look, he is in the desert, do not go out. Or look, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. The inner rooms here is kind of a reference to the temple, because you have the holy and the holy of holies inside of the temple, and I'm pretty sure that this is what that's talking about. Because when we get to three false prophets, I'm going to talk about three false prophets that were specifically mentioned by Josephus. The first one is Theudas from 46 AD. Now, it's interesting because there's another Theudas that's mentioned in Acts in 5:36 to 37. But this is probably, this has to be a different Theudas than the one that's mentioned in Acts, because the one in Acts was mentioned to have risen up about during the time of the census. Back when Jesus was first born, the whole reason why he ends up in Bethlehem is because of the census. But that's the Theudas from Acts. But the Theudas in Josephus's writings, it was more in around 46 AD. But he said he took a group of people out to the Jordan, and claiming to be the Messiah, and said that he was going to be able to part the waters like Moses did. And he brought a whole bunch of people out there, and then the governor sent his troops out and just murdered us everyone. So there's 2,000-ish people. Was it 2,000? It's thousands of people that followed Theudas out, and they're all assassinated because of being rebels and rising up against the Romans is what they accounted it to. Okay. And then the next one I want to talk about is an unnamed man. They just call him the Egyptian. And this one is also really cool because this Egyptian is also mentioned in the book of Acts. This is he's barely mentioned, but when Paul is under trial, was it Felix? It was either Felix or Festus, I forget which one. But one of them said, aren't you that Egyptian who caused all that trouble? And he's talking about this Egyptian who apparently, he took 4,000 people out to the Mount of Olives where, Jesus gave his Olivet Discourse. And he said he could make the walls of the temple just fall down. Like he would just call on God. God was going to take the walls down and they were going to be able to launch an assault and take the city. Of course, that didn't happen. The Romans came out and slaughtered thousands of people. But the Egyptian apparently got away scot-free. He didn't get caught because when Paul's during his trial, they're asking if he's him. So he was never brought to justice. But all the people who were foolish enough to follow him out there kind of paid the consequence for it. And I've read that people think he was probably using the prophecy from Hosea 11:1, where he says, "From out of Egypt I will call my son." I think that's why he's just referred to as the Egyptian, because he was playing up on that specific prophecy that the Messiah was going to come out of Egypt. And then the last one I want to talk about is during the actual destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So in the last moments as the temple was burning, Josephus mentions a man. He doesn't have a name, but he just says that he was a false prophet who convinced the people to climb up on top of the temple as it was burning, saying that God was going to deliver them and destroy the Romans. So it was a very a futile attempt where I don't know how, it doesn't say how many people actually followed him. But if you remember, the Romans set fire to the temple, the Jews kind of stopped attacking the Romans because they were trying to put it out. And apparently this guy was also trying to convince people to just climb up on the burning temple and that God was going to save them all. So, yeah, these are three just specific false prophets that are mentioned by Josephus. But that doesn't mean that these are the only false prophets. These are just ones that we know about through the Bible, through Josephus. And there are also false prophets, false messiahs that come afterwards. I want to talk a bit about the Bar Kokhba revolt. So this is about 60, 70 years after Jerusalem is destroyed, after the temple is destroyed. And you think that the Jews would have learned their lesson and not been rebelling against Rome in their prime, but you'd think wrong. So according to the Talmud, there were 3 rabbis who went to the ruins of the temple, and they were distraught about its destruction, and they see a fox come out of where the foundation of the temple was. And they take that as a sign that the Messiah is coming. Well, they find this man. His name was Simon Bar Kokhba, I believe, but he gets renamed as Simon Bar Kokhba because Kokhba means Bar Kokhba means son of the star, and they were using this prophecy from Numbers 24:17 that says, "A star shall come out of Jacob, a scepter shall rise out of Israel." So they were trying to apply this prophecy to this man, Bar Kokhba, who was leading this revolt again in about 130 AD. There's not a lot of historical record about the Bar Kokhba revolt. There's not a lot of information. They didn't have Josephus like we have for 70 AD, so we don't get a lot of the information about what exactly happened. But it lasted about 3 years. They were relatively successful in that they were able to regain the Temple Mount for a little while, regain Jerusalem for a little bit, but it was mostly like a guerrilla warfare where they had all these caves out in the wilderness, out in the desert, and they would do these. They were able to manage to fight against the Romans for about 3 years until they were ultimately stopped and destroyed. And the last battle happened on Tish B'Av, which is when the temple was destroyed. So that's another reason why the Jews consider Tisha B'Av as this day of mourning, because of this revolt that failed on that day, and there was a mass slaughtering of the people who rebelled against the Romans. But this, this really angered the Romans, as you can imagine. So this is during Emperor Hadrian's reign, but to punish them, like they end up doing this mass slaughtering of the Jews in the region. It's hard to get specific numbers on how many were killed, but they almost consider it, some people consider it genocide, and that they said that up to like 2/3 of the Jewish population was killed after this. They, at this point, so Jews after 70 AD had been sold into slavery, and they had been mostly barred from being inside of Jerusalem. But now now after the Bar Kokhba revolt, Hadrian implements you can't enter this city under pain of death. Like if Jews who tried to enter in would be slaughtered. They kind of ease that back after Hadrian, and they start allowing them to come in on the one day of the year on Tisha B'Av. But they also like put restrictions on being able to read the Torah, observing the Sabbath. They were trying to curtail a lot of Jewish acts of worship. They named Syria, or they renamed Judea to Syria Palestinia. And this is where we get our modern day Palestine. They were trying to kind of take away the Jewish context to that region, because Judea is it's the land of the Jews. Syria Palestine, it was supposed to be, I'm not exactly sure where they got the Palestinia from, but that's the name that kind of stuck for the next couple hundred years. He builds a new temple, so Hadrian, he renames Jerusalem to Aelia Capitolina, and he also builds a temple to Jupiter on the Temple Mount, where the original temple was that was destroyed. And this is it's more of like sticking it to the Jews that this was your holy site, we've taken it, we are now building a temple to a Roman god here. And he also had a statue of Hadrian there as well to signify. So whenever they would see it, they'd be like, yes, the Hadrian destroyed us. This is a Roman site now. Any questions on all that? But that kind of curtails into the next prophecy. This is from Luke 21:24. But he says, "And they will fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive of all nations in Jerusalem, and will be trampled by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled." So I already talked about how after 70 AD, Josephus puts the numbers up in the millions. I don't know how accurate that is, but like 1 million Jews were enslaved and killed after 70 AD, which is a lot. They were sent around to different areas as captives. They were forced to fight in the games. In Jerusalem itself, the 10th Legion, Legio Ex Fretensis, they're the ones who are stationed in Jerusalem after that. And I'm gonna go back because I want to talk real quick about underneath Wilson's Arch. Like we were talking about how they've been doing these excavations. There's a lot of, they have graffiti in there from the 10th Legion. Like they actually wrote on the stones, and they built a little amphitheater down there. Like it's a small little theater, but it was built by that Legion as a place for them to come and enjoy shows and stuff, which is, it's just interesting that still is preserved there, that the 10th Legion, you'll find coins and stuff minted for the 10th Legion around that area. But I want to talk, yeah, go ahead.
Just as a side thing, because you mentioned Palestine, and of course I'm over here, I gotta find out. Evidently Palestine was the name for the Philistines.
Oh, yeah.
Philistia.
Right.
And so the name, from what I just read, the name of them changing it to Palestine was naming it after the enemies of the Jews
yeah.
before. But it was it was a broader name than just the specific people we read about in the Old Testament. It was kind of a generic term they used for people that lived in that area.
Yeah, I think I remember reading that at one point, but that's, yeah. They were really sticking it to them for rebelling again. Like they were really trying to put down Jewish nationalism and trying to, blot out any kind of zealotism that might have still remained. Okay, so I want to talk about kind of a timeline of what's happened on the Temple Mount since 70 AD to today. And I want to talk about 3 failed attempts that happened of trying to rebuild the temple. So, we talked about the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. And then we had the temple to Jupiter was built about 132 during the Bar Kokhba revolt. Now, there's debate about which came first. Did they start building the temple and that triggered the Bar Kokhba revolt? Or was the temple built as a punishment for the Bar Kokhba revolt? There's kind of differing sources on that, and like I said, there's not a lot of historical record for what happened. So it's not certain, but what is certain is that this temple was built, and it stood on the Temple Mount for about 200 years-ish. It was destroyed by Constantine. So Constantine, he was famously the first Christian emperor, and he came back to Jerusalem, and they built the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. They built all these like Christian kind of monuments, but they didn't really care so much about the Temple Mount. They wanted to get rid of pagan idols and worship and all that. So the temple was destroyed as part of that edict. But as far as the Temple Mount itself, it was kind of just forgotten about. Some sources say it was used as like a dumping ground, that they would just throw trash and waste there. But for the most part, the Temple Mount was ignored up until we get to 685 when they build the Dome of the Rock, which is built over top of the site of the first temple. But between that, there was these 3 kind of attempts where the Jews tried to rebuild the temple, but all 3 of them failed. So in the Bar Kokhba revolt that we just talked about, they did get control of the Temple Mount for a while, and I believe that they started repairing the foundations, but that was about as far as they got before they were driven out of the city, and it didn't go much beyond just working on the foundations. Then I want to talk about what happened during Julian the Apostate's rule. So I brought this up a couple weeks ago, but Julian the Apostate was he's sometimes called like the last pagan emperor, because he came after Constantine. He was Constantine's nephew, I believe, but he didn't want to give up the old Roman ways, even though that Christianity at this point had been made the official religion of the empire. He couldn't really get that backtracked. He couldn't really get the whole empire to go back to being pagan. But he wanted to support the Jews. And one of the things he did was he commissioned them to start working and rebuilding the temple. But as they started working and getting the equipment set up, and there was this account from this historian, Ammianus Marcellinus, and this account is also recorded in like 5 or 6 other Christian historical records, but I think this one carries a little bit more weight because it's not from a Christian source. But he said, fearful balls of fire burst forth with the continual eruptions close to the foundations, talking about the foundations of the temple they were trying to rebuild, burning several of the workmen and making the spot altogether inaccessible. So there was this kind of, it's hard to say divine intervention, but it sounds like divine intervention, where fire came out of the ground, burned the men, burned their equipment, and they had to stop construction on the temple. I find this extremely fascinating. I think it's a true account because it's mentioned multiple times. Can't say for certain, but it definitely feels like they tried to build the temple and God said, no, you're not going to build the temple here. Okay, and then the third time that the temple was kind of rebuilt, there is a war that happened between, so this is getting a little confusing, but the Byzantines was the the western half of the Roman Empire. The Sassanids are basically, just think of them as the Persians. It was like northern Iraq, Syria, Iran. The Byzantine Empire by about in the 600s was kind of waning a little bit, and the Sassanids decided to take advantage of that, and they conquer down the coastline, and they conquer Jerusalem relatively easily. But there was this general named Shabaraz, and the Jewish population, so a lot of Jews had been dispersed because they weren't allowed to live in Jerusalem. They weren't allowed to live in the area. And a lot of them had been dispersed up into like this northern Syria, and they were part of the Sassanid Empire. And they had allied themselves with the Sassanids, and as kind of a reward, they allowed the Jews to have control of Jerusalem once they conquered it. And there was a man who was named Nehemiah ben Hushiel, and he was referred to as a Messiah. They called it, I don't know if he himself called himself a Messiah, but the rabbis of the time declared him to be a Messiah, and that he was going to rebuild the temple. But that fell through. They started work, they didn't get very far, and then just a couple months later, weeks later, they had driven the Christians out of Jerusalem, but they came back, took back control of the city, and work on the temple halted after that. Nathaniel was killed when the Christians took the city back. Once again showing that he wasn't the Messiah that they thought him to be. Okay, so this brings us up to the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem. And so on the Temple Mount today, it's still here. It's been there for over 1,000 years. You have the Dome of the Rock, and you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And the Dome of the Rock is a location where the Muslims believe that Muhammad ascended to heaven to meet with previous prophets and with God after he traveled from Mecca. But there is no archaeological or historical actual evidence that Muhammad actually even made it to Jerusalem or went to Jerusalem. And it's really more just when the Muslims had control of the city, they wanted to build a shrine where the temple was. Originally, they wanted Jerusalem to be the holiest site. So there's 3 major holy sites in Islam. There's Mecca, Medina, and then Jerusalem, where the Dome of the Rock is. Originally, they wanted Jerusalem to be one of the holiest sites, but he was rejected when Muhammad tried to convert a lot of the Jews in Medina to Islam. They rejected him as a false prophet, and that kind of upset Muhammad, and they decided that Mecca was going to be the most holy site. And what's interesting about that is so Al-Aqsa Mosque is on the southern side, and if you were praying in the mosque, you would be praying south towards Saudi Arabia, towards where Mecca is, and you would have your back towards the Dome on the Rock. And I think that was specifically done as a way of kind of shunning the Jews for rejecting him. But yeah, I think that's, I don't think there was anything else I want to say about that. Just other than the fact that, we're talking about traveling till the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. I don't specifically know what that means when we say till the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled, but I have a very hard time believing that one of the holiest sites for Islam is going to be removed and a new temple is going to be built on its spot. And that's why I'm going to pose the question here is will the temple ever be rebuilt? My answer is no. I don't think that's ever going to happen. And the temple doesn't need to be rebuilt, right? We have a new covenant with God. The temple was the place of worship under the old covenant. When we read 1 Corinthians 3:16, it says, "Do you not know that you are the temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you?" And Ephesians 2:19 through 22. "Now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building being fitted together grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you are being built together for a dwelling place for the Spirit of God. So we're given this picture that the temple is not a physical building anymore. It's a spiritual building. It's Jesus is the cornerstone, the apostles are the foundation, and we are the stones that make up the temple. I feel like the temple will not be rebuilt because it doesn't need to be rebuilt, because it's moved from a physical to a spiritual under the new covenant. Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with you 100%, but I do have some Jewish friends.
Mm-hmm.
They're preparing, they want to do it right now.
Yeah, there's a lot of groups out there that want the temple to be rebuilt. With this Iran war going on, I saw a lot of people like hoping that the Dome of the Rock's going to get hit by a missile and then they can start work on rebuilding the temple. And there's evangelical Christians. Yeah, evangelical Christians are actively working with the Jews mostly to try to get the temple rebuilt, because they think it's going to trigger the second coming of Christ. They think that, like, calling on him like a genie, like if they do the right things, that they can force the second coming to happen, which is, it's blasphemy. I don't know if blasphemy is the right word, but it's crazy to think that you can force the hand of God by your actions. God's going to come when it's just going to come when it's time. Yes?
Wouldn't Jesus' return be the temple being rebuilt, since he essentially is the temple?
Yeah, so, Josh, you want to take this? I can see.
So there are many different views on end times, and there are many religious denominational groups that believe that when Jesus returns, he is going to set up a physical temple in Jerusalem. Those are the same groups that he was talking about there that are Gentile Americans in particular that are dumping money into Israel because they want to try to instigate the next coming. Not everybody believes that there is going to be a literal temple built. It depends on your interpretation of the book of Revelation, and specifically the section about the millennium.
Does the Church of Christ have a...
You will find people of all sorts, because there's no official Church of Christ doctrine on anything. I can speak for myself, and I know a lot of people that I study with are what are called amillennial, which means we believe that the millennium and the physical temple is all symbolic. And so it's my personal study, but I can change it, if I see competing evidence, that whenever Jesus returns, that'll be it for the world. It'll be, everybody will either ascend or, it'll be the division of time, and then the world's going to be destroyed. So, but it is admittedly very, very complicated, because Ezekiel has...
Touchy subject.
Oh,
Yeah.
And it's not just touchy, it is legitimately complicated. And so a lot of grace needs to exist.
Right. Yeah, I'm not getting into a lot of the different beliefs and thoughts out there. I'm just kind of giving you my opinion and my belief that I don't think the temple is ever going to be rebuilt, that we now live in, we are basically, the church is the temple, that we are a spiritual temple. But yeah. Okay. Anybody else have any questions or thoughts? All right, we'll go ahead. That's the end of it. I know we made it. Well, I did have some bonus material, but we think we're good. This is what I didn't get to earlier, but there's